was the good news, this week the bad news. And this is bad news. I don't know how else to put it, because it is possible to start out on the right foot and end up going the wrong way. And this is basically the case of Solomon. As you know, as we've gone through Kings and Chronicles, King David, a man after God's own heart, and yet a man with blood on his hands, wanted to build the temple, and God said, no, but your son will. And God specifically chose Solomon over some of David's other sons. And God promised a number of things to David about his lineage and then to Solomon. But some of these promises were unconditional. Others were conditional. Conditional upon Solomon's behavior and his response to the Lord. So when he became king, God asked him, what do you want? And he asked for wisdom and insight. And God was so impressed, he not only gave him wisdom and insight, but blessed him otherwise as well. Last week, as we went through lesson number 7, we talked about the fact that Israel was perhaps the greatest nation on earth during King Solomon's reign. He was probably the wisest king, maybe the richest king, maybe even the most powerful king on earth at that time. This was the apex of the nation of Israel. However, we're going to get into lesson number 8 and talk about Solomon's decline. And guys, watch out for women. They'll do it to you every time. And Solomon was, as we go into this lesson, was, I believe, following a practice of the day. And one of the ways you made peace with other nations and with other peoples was to marry. And so these kings had many wives, and as long as there was a daughter or a relative of another king that was married to your king, there was some sort of peace between these societies. And so Solomon ended up marrying women he never should have married, and they ended up bringing into the empire and into his life things that never should have been brought in. And this eventually corrupts him. And God ends up judging his kingdom. He was allowed to live, but even though he was allowed to live, his nation would be broken up. And we're going to talk a little bit about Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We're going to talk a little bit about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And this is all very, very important. It's like reading a mystery novel. And most of you, if you read a mystery novel, don't start halfway through, because you're going to, what in the world has happened here? Well, this is the case with the Old Testament. If you pick up partway through the Old Testament, you'll scratch your head and go, what happened? You know? And so this is all foundational in our understanding of the rest of the Old Testament. And again, this even affects the New Testament, because again, the promise that is reiterated to Solomon about David's covenant, the Davidic covenant, extends all the way to Jesus, because he is a descendant of David through the proper line. And again, we talked a little bit about that at Christmas time. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11. And if you have your Bibles, that follows 1 Kings chapter 10. And I need a volunteer to read the first 8 verses, please.
Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which Jehovah said to the sons of Israel, you will not go among them, neither will they come among you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. And it happened when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with Jehovah his God, as was the heart of David his father. And Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, And Solomon did that what was evil in the sight of Jehovah, and went not fully after Jehovah, as did David his father. Then Solomon built a high place for Shemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the mountain that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the sons of Ammon. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who burnt incense and sacrificed to their gods.
So, as I said, we've gone from good news to bad news.
In a hurry.
Now, again, this did not change the Davidic covenant, but it did change the outcome of the promise that God made to Solomon. And basically, if you serve me, I will bless you. And if you turn away from me, you're going to suffer the consequences. And so that's the situation here. So your study guide says Deuteronomy records detailed instructions for future kings of Israel. They were not to accumulate horses, wives, or silver and gold. And as we've seen last week, and now as we've read this week, what did Solomon accumulate?
Exactly
A
that.
whole lot of silver and gold.
The very things that he was not supposed to accumulate.
Wise.
But it wasn't the gold and silver that really was his problem. It was the many wives that were his problem. Now again, this was a way of making alliances, political alliances. And so, you know, we talk a lot about, it's all about the politics. Well, it was all about the politics of the day. So he has married Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Egyptians, Sidonians, Hittites, Canaanites. And again, the whole idea, Solomon could have initially rationalized this away, saying, well, this is good for the nation. You know, we'll have peace if I have these alliances. Well, it wasn't good in the long run, because on page 65 of your study guide, down the second column down, it says Solomon's marriages, on the right-hand column, Solomon's marriages became affairs of the heart as well as affairs of state. The Hebrew verb to love is not common in the Old Testament. It occurs only twice in Kings. First, it is used to describe Solomon's love for the Lord. And then, in this passage, it is used to describe Solomon's love for his foreign wives. His love for his wives increased, his passion for God diminished. Okay? So, you remember Isaac Newton and his laws of physics? And one of them is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite what? Reaction. So, our heart can ultimately only be devoted in love to one thing. Jesus says you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and mammon, mammon being riches. And again, our heart, we're not talking about our physical organ. We're talking about the real you, your soul, your spirit, or whatever. And so anyway, this affected his relationship with God. There's a Hebrew noun based on this verb in 1 Kings 10:9, where the Queen of Sheba spoke of God's eternal love for Israel. The same noun describes Solomon's tenacious love for his harem of 700 royal wives and 300 porcupines, as the little boy said. So, what is a harem? Well, on page 66 of your study guide, there is a box that says a devoted harem. Would somebody read that for us?
In the Bible, several things or people are described as devoted to the Lord. Jericho might best be known example. See Joshua 6:17. While holy things were set apart to the Lord for the purpose of the service, devoted things were set apart for destruction. Arabic uses the same noun to describe the wives of the sheik. They were set apart to him, and anyone who dared to approach them would be executed. After the Crusades, the Arabic term entered English as a loan word, harem. Solomon's harem consisted of 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Now, for a man who's supposedly wise, how did he get into this situation? A husband and wife's relationship is a unique thing, and I simply don't understand how some men around the world have practiced polygamy old expression, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Well, how do you keep, it's hard enough for us to keep one wife happy. How do you keep 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, let alone a harem like this? So obviously, as an attempt to keep these wives happy, he started to compromise. Oh, okay, you're from a different culture, you have a different God. All right, I'll build a shrine, I'll build a high place so you can do your thing. Well, pretty soon, this affected Solomon's relationship with God. And again, you wonder sometimes, when you take a look at Israel and their history, how in the world they could turn their back on God after all he had done for them. But yet, it is his history. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that the Bible's true. The Bible paints all these characters, forgive me for saying it, with all their warts, with all their wrinkles, with all their imperfections. They're not superhuman. You know, David did go out and slay Goliath, but he's portrayed later on with all of his problems, and he had problems. Here's Solomon, who's asked for wisdom and is the wisest man on earth, and yet look what he gets himself involved in. So we are all sinners. I think one of the reasons why Scripture portrays all of this for us is to show our need for a Savior. None of us are good enough on our own. None of us can atone for our own sin. We need a Savior. Solomon needed a Savior. I believe Solomon was saved, if you want to call it that. There's a very interesting article I read this about a week ago on where people in the Old Testament saved. Well, again, normally it's a term that we use in the New Testament for somebody who's believed on Jesus after his death, burial, and resurrection. But what we're saying is, did they have a relationship with God based on faith? And I believe Solomon did. But his heart got turned away from the Lord. There's no two ways about that. And so it became a problem. So, let's talk about God predicts the divided kingdom. So God knows exactly what's going to happen. And again, several of us have watched a video recently where Mike Winger has in one screen and a famous televangelist is on another screen. And he basically is telling people that we're like God, and all you have to do is say something. All you have to do is claim it, it will come to pass. And Mike Winger does a beautiful job of explaining this passage in Romans. It's not talking about humans, it's talking about God. Only God can foresee the future and speak the future. And he goes to Isaiah and proves it with a passage in Isaiah, where God basically says to the nation of Israel, well, you want to be like me? You want to be God? Well, then you tell me what's going to happen. You predict the future. Well, this is what is happening here. God predicts the future and has it nailed. So let's take a look at verses 9 through 13.
The Lord was angry with Solomon because he turned his heart away from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had warned him about this, that he should not follow other gods, but he was disobedient to the Lord's command. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since you have done this and have not kept my covenant and statutes which I commanded you, I will surely take the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. I will not do this in your lifetime for your father's David's sake, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not take the whole kingdom away, but will preserve one tribe for your son, for David, my servant's sake, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I chose.
Okay, we're going to talk about this as we go along. You might say, wait a minute, I did pass basic math, and I know that 1 plus 10 equals 11, not 12. So what happened? Well, there's an explanation in your study guide as to exactly what happened there. So anyway, we're going to get into this period of time after Solomon died, when the nation does get divided between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We're going to be introduced here to Jeroboam here in just a minute, but we end up with what is called the divided kingdom. So at this point, we're still in what is called the United Kingdom, if you take a look at Old Testament history, but that is soon going to change. All right, so God had chosen Solomon. He had extended his blessing to Solomon, but he had appeared to Solomon twice. And in these appearances, he warned Solomon of what would happen. And if you take a look at near the bottom of page 67 on the left-hand column, it says that warning had come after the 24th year of Solomon's 40-year reign, when his palace was completed. And it is likely that Solomon was being influenced by his wives at that time. So remember, Solomon has a 40-year reign. So only slightly over halfway through, he's already starting to have issues. And God warns him, and he really doesn't want to listen. So your study guide says that it is likely that the prophet, perhaps Ahijah, Iddo, or maybe even elderly Nathan, were the ones who actually brought this message to Solomon. And again, we don't know exactly. But he starts to compromise, and compromise a little bit at a time. And so the warning is that you will have a united kingdom. But once you die, it's going to be divided, and not even fairly. It's not like 6 and 6. It's going to be 10 and 1, and the 1 is really 2. We'll get into that. So let's take a look at God raises external enemies. Remember, early on in Solomon's reign, there was peace. He had inherited a time of peace from David, his father. But some of these enemies were still out there. They were just laying low, waiting for a sign of weakness. And without getting into modern day politics, if you take a look at the international political scene, there are nations who are still our enemies. And they would love to take advantage of any perceived weakness in the United States. And I think that that is what you see going on right now, perceived weakness.
Oh, yes.
All right, so would somebody read verses 14 to 25?
And the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the king's seat in Edom. For it came to pass, when David was in Edom, and Joab the captain of the host was gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male in Edom, for 6 months did Joab remain there with all Israel, until he had cut off every male in Edom, that Hadad fled, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, to go into Egypt, Hadad being yet a little child. And they arose out of Midian, and came to Paran, and they took men with them out of Paran, and they came to Egypt, under Pharaoh king of Egypt, which gave him an house, and appointed him victuals, and gave him land. And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him to wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of Taphanes the queen. And the sister of Taphanes bare him Genubath his son, whom Taphanes weaned in Pharaoh's house. And Genubath was in Pharaoh's household among the sons of Pharaoh. And when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab the captain of the host was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, Let me depart, that I may go to mine own country. Then Pharaoh said unto him, But what hast thou lacked with me, that behold thou seekest to go to thine own country? And he answered, Nothing, howbeit let me go in any wise. And God stirred him up another adversary, Rezon the son of Eliada, which fled from his lord Hadadezer king of Zobah. And he gathered men unto him, and became captain over a band, when David slew them of Zobah. And they went to Damascus, and dwelt therein, and reigned in Damascus. And he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, beside the mischief that Hadad did. And he abhorred Israel, and reigned over Syria.
Okay, so the problem was, during David's time, when he sent Joab down, he didn't eat them, all of them.
Hadad.
Hadad, yes. Anyway, some got away, including Hadad, and he goes down to Egypt. And if you take a look at page 69 of your study guide, you're going to see a map there of Israel, and you have Hadad and Edom, that's in the south, that's the bottom, and then you have the Damascus Association coming from the north. So there's threats from the north and the south that Solomon did not originally have. Now, again, this problem had never totally gone away. It had just kind of died down. And so Hadad, he makes it down to Egypt, and he too does what Solomon does. He establishes an alliance with Pharaoh by marrying a relative of Pharaoh. And so now Pharaoh is interested in the Edomites that are left as well as the Israelites. Less is said about Rezon other than about Hadad, other than that he had an organized threat. And this comes from Damascus. Interestingly enough, times have never changed, because now you have the Egyptians in the Sinai Peninsula. Again, remember, Israel gave that back, Sinai, so that's a problem in the south. And in Damascus, that is the capital of what nation? Syria. And look at all that's going on in Syria right now. So it's amazing to me how these things tend to repeat themselves over and over again. And so on the bottom of page 69 it says, by the end of his reign, Solomon was pressured by experienced hostile foes on his northeast and southeast frontiers. But the most serious threat lay within Solomon's own government. Now we're going to meet Jeroboam. So let's take a look at verses 26 through 40, please.
Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zediah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, the widow, also lifted up his hand against the king. And this was the reason why he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the breach of the city of David his father. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. And at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Then Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemoth, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my rules, as David his father did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. For I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give to you 10 tribes. Yet to his son I will give one tribe, that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to put my name. And I will take you, and you shall reign over all this. Let me do that sentence again. And I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my father did, my servant did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you, and I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. How far am I supposed to go?
40.
One more verse. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon.
So the proverbial plot thickens. So now you have Ahijah, who is a prophet of God, who comes and delivers a prophecy, a very specific prophecy. It's kind of a illustrated sermon.
An illustrated sermon, right? Too.
Right.
Sermon right on the side of the road.
Right. So Jeroboam was from Ephraim, which is the northern tribe of Israel. And he was obviously an insider. He was famed for his wisdom, justice, and righteousness. But he ends up initiating a rebellion against Solomon. Jeroboam was a very capable. The expression man of standing reads mighty, valiant man. When applied to a soldier, it speaks to ability more than rank. So this guy had a lot of responsibility.
He was talented.
He was put in charge of this works project. And your study guide points out about how Israelite workers were conscripted 1 month out of every 3 to move timber from Lebanon to Jerusalem. And then there was the non-Israelite conscripted labor force. So Jeroboam is involved with all of this. A very influential, very important job. So if we were to equate it today, we would have the President of the United States would be like a king. Then we have his cabinet secretaries, secretaries of different departments. It's like Jeroboam was one of the cabinet secretaries. It was like the Department of Labor. So he was very important. So Ahijah the prophet, who is from Shiloh, which is a town in Ephraim, a little more than 20 miles north of Jerusalem. And that's where the tabernacle had been. He delivers this message for him, and it has to do with tearing an outer garment. And he tears this new robe into 12 pieces. And basically, he tells Jeroboam to take 10 of the pieces, because this God is going to give him the 10 northern tribes, Israel. God is going to give him. You know, oftentimes we look at Jeroboam as a usurper. We look at him in a negative light because Israel ends up failing. We see that spiritually. But initially, this was God's idea. Okay, so we've got to be careful how we judge Jeroboam here. And only one tribe would remain under Solomon. And again, you might say, well, how in the world does that work? If you take a look at the bottom of page 71, in the right-hand column, it says, scholars offer differing suggestions about how to divide the 12 tribes of Israel into kingdoms of 10 tribes and 1. Obviously, Judah was the one tribe. Some suggest that Simeon had become absorbed within Judah and had lost its separate identity. Benjamin would be counted with the northern kingdom because Bethel, Ramah, and Jericho, important sites in Benjamin, defected to the north. Others suggest that Simeon had migrated into territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and to be numbered among the northern tribes with its view. Simeon could not be counted as a full tribe by either kingdom because of its divided loyalties and territories between the two. So again, when you read it, you're going, wait a minute, 10 plus 1 equals 11, not 12. But anyway, this is the idea. By the way, on page 71 also of your study guide, there's an interesting little box about Canaanite gods and goddesses, and there were many of them. And so you have the names on the left side, you have the nations on the right side, and it gives you a little bit of an idea, and it gives a little definition of who these gods supposedly were. Now, that is not to imply that there is more than one God. There is only one God. Now, the promise is that Rehoboam, who is going to be Solomon's son, would inherit the one. And this one would include Jerusalem. And all of this was because of God's love for who? David. So we have the Davidic covenant. Hang on to that thought, because that thought is going to be the glue that holds everything together throughout the rest of the Old Testament. God gets very upset not only with Israel, God gets upset with Judah. God has the Assyrians take the 10 northern tribes into captivity. God has the Babylonians take the southern tribe, Judah nation, into captivity. But he returns them to the land. And there is a promise that there will be a Davidic king. Now, when the last Davidic king to actually rule was when the Babylonians took them into captivity. When they came back from Babylon, there never was a quote-unquote Davidic kingdom. There is not one today. God has brought the people of Israel back to the land. I don't believe it's a coincidence. I believe it is a miracle. Never before in human history has anything like it but they are a political government. If you don't believe that, just read the news and try to figure out the politics in Israel. But I mentioned this before, and I'll say it again, that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel do not recognize the current government of Israel. They're living in the land because they believe that's their responsibility. They are waiting for a Davidic king. And we believe that Jesus is that king, he is the Messiah, he will return, he will rule from his father David's throne in Jerusalem, and he will reestablish this. So, anyway, God is going to protect the identity. It's going to be shrunk, and they will have Jerusalem because of God's love for David. And so, anyway, in disobedience to Ahijah's prophecy, Jeroboam doesn't wait for Solomon to die. He goes ahead and rebels now, and Solomon tries to kill him, and so he has to run. Where again? Egypt. It's amazing how many times throughout the Bible, whenever they're in trouble, they run to Egypt. And yet even Joseph, the husband of Mary, takes the baby Jesus and goes to Egypt, and it says, out of Egypt I will call my son. So it's a very interesting relationship. But anyway, Shishak, the first pharaoh of Egypt, whose name is recorded in the Bible. Up until now, just the pharaoh. But now we actually have a name for this. Shishak was a Libyan warlord who defeated the pharaoh whose daughter Solomon had married, and who founded the 22nd dynasty, which lasted more than 2 centuries. Soon he would invade Judah and carry off the wealth that Solomon had amassed. Remember we talked about all the shields that Solomon had built and their value? It lasted just a few years. And then when Solomon died and Rehoboam screwed up everything, here comes Shishak, the pharaoh of Egypt, and takes them south. All right, let's take a look at 1 Kings chapter 11, and then 2 Chronicles 9:29 to 31 in brief. Would somebody read that for us, please?
Solomon died after a 40-year reign over a united Israel and was buried alongside David in the old part of Jerusalem. Solomon's son Rehoboam succeeded him as king. The writer of Kings referred to the official government annals for further reference, while the chronicler referred to the writings of 3 prophets contemporary with Solomon.
So if you have 2 Kings, would somebody turn, since we have a little time left,
2 Chronicles.
2 Chronicles, chapter 9. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, and read verses 29 through 31 for us.
Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, first and last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddu the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? And Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned instead of him.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, from now on, from here on out, as you read the Old Testament, it's going to talk about Israel and Judah. Okay? Prior to this, Israel was synonymous with all 12 tribes, with a united kingdom. But from now on, when you're reading, remember that Israel means the northern kingdom. And Samaria became the capital of the northern kingdom. When you read about Judah, you're no longer talking about just a tribe, you're talking about the southern kingdom. And Jerusalem becomes the capital of the southern kingdom. This even affects the New Testament. One of my favorite passages in the Gospel of John is John chapter 4, with Jesus meeting with the woman at the well. And by the way, just a side note, if you ever want to encourage somebody to start reading the Bible who's never read it before, and either they're not a believer or they're a brand spanking new believer and know very little, really the Gospel of John is a very, very good place for them to start. A lot of the times people want to go right to the book of Revelation. They don't understand anything. And of course they don't understand anything. because it takes a lot of pre-knowledge to understand where Revelation's coming from. But anyway, in John chapter 4, you have Jesus, and he wants to go from the south to the north. Now, remember, the 10 northern tribes had been basically evacuated. They'd been assimilated and taken into the Assyrian Empire. But the riffraff that was left intermarried because they then, Assyria took people and brought them down to where Israel was. And these people became the Samaritans, okay? And the Jews of Judah hated the Samaritans. So even during Jesus' day, where there's no longer two kingdoms, it's all one big territory divided up into provinces, Jews would go to the east. They would cross the Jordan River, go up the east side of the Jordan, and then cross back to get into the Galilee because they didn't want to be contaminated by going into the Samaritans. The Samaritans were still worshiping in Samaria. They had their own practices, and they didn't accept all of the Old Testament that the Jews did. And so anyway, Jesus, it says, had to go through Samaria. Well, he didn't. Every other Jew would have gone east, up, and then come back. But he goes through Samaria for a purpose. He goes to Jacob's well, and he meets the Samaritan woman. He sends his disciples off for food, and I think that was kind of an excuse so that he could meet with this woman one-on-one. And he does the unthinkable. He talks to her. First of all, he's a Jew and she's a Samaritan. Number two, he's a man, she's a woman. Jewish men don't talk to women that aren't their wives. And then look at her reputation. She has a horrible, horrible reputation. And yet he, through love and grace, presents himself to her. She hears that he knows everything about her. She runs back to town, says, here's a man who knows everything about me. They come and they listen, and apparently they believe, which is interesting because how many of the Jews who were from Jerusalem, who were students of the law, reject Jesus, and you have these Samaritans who are believing in Jesus. But anyway, all of this is a play that goes all the way back to the time we're talking about now, when the nation divided. And so there are consequences that go clear off into the New Testament. One of the things that many people ask today is whatever happened to the 10 northern tribes? Okay, they were assimilated into the Assyrian Empire, they were scattered abroad. The Jews from Judah definitely returned to Jerusalem, they rebuild, they are totally identifiable. My answer, and again, I have to use my pea brain when I'm sorting out things like this, is that God knows exactly where they're at and where they're from. Because when you get to the book of Revelation, you have the 144,000 witnesses of Jehovah. They're not Jehovah's Witnesses.
No.
They're witnesses of Jehovah.
Please get that word order right.
Yeah, get that straight. And anyway, it says that there is 12,000 from what?
Each
tribe.
Each of the 12
tribe.
tribes of Israel. So God knows where these people are. Okay, I reject what is called British Israelism. There were different individuals who have proposed this over the years, one of them being Herbert W. Armstrong, who founded the Worldwide Church of God. He believed that the people in the British Isles, and therefore Americans, were descendants of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and that we needed to go back and keep the Jewish Sabbath, we needed to keep all the Jewish feasts and all this other garbage. Yeah. Herbert W. Armstrong was definitely a cultist. But anyway, this whole idea of British Israelism has been adopted in some senses, because even in Great Britain today, they have a beautiful national hymn that they sing about Jerusalem. And if you listen to the words, they believe that they are the New Jerusalem. And which is totally false, okay? Totally false. So I do not believe in British Israelism. I do not believe I believe, yes, the 10 tribes were scattered, but God knows where they're at.
So So some have theorized that the gypsies here in the United States are part of Israel.
The gypsies.
Yes.
I've heard that. But I
Um,
never could understand their basis. Did you know why?
No, I don't know. I just
the
heard that.
gypsies, if I understand it right, most of them are descendants from Eastern Europe.
Right, they came from
Right.
Hungary
So-
area.
I have no clue as to their actual origin. Hungary is what I believe originally, but I don't know. The Mormons have their own theory, coming from Joseph Smith, that the Indian tribes,
Yeah,
the
that's even a
descendants
little-
of Israel, they got on boats and sailed across the ocean blue, and we have an interesting video in our library.
Methinks that Joseph Smith had been smoking too much peyote.
Well, I tell you, if you had a set of golden plates and special eyeglasses, maybe you'd come up with this theory too, I don't know. But anyway, we have a video, I think it's still in the library, old VHS video called The DNA and Mormonism. And basically, scientists who were raised as Mormons
Mhm.
started doing research, and they presented this research to the Mormon Church saying there is no evidence linguistically, socially, or physically, meaning DNA, that the Indian North American tribes, we call Indian tribes, or any relationship to the Israelites whatsoever. These scientists were excommunicated from the Mormon Church over their findings, because the Mormon Church does not like it at all. Okay. So anyway,
Hierarchy just based on a
Right.
power trip.
Well, they even believe that Jesus somehow made a special appearance in North America to the Indian tribes. And they have names, I don't even remember all of the names in the Book of Mormon, but it's total falsehood. So, so again, I have no idea about gypsies. Like I say, I blatantly reject the idea of British Israelism. That doesn't mean there may not be descendants of the 12 tribes, 10 tribes, northern tribes, who ended up in England or ended up in the United States. I mean, we have Jewish people in the United States today. In fact, for a while, the United States had the largest Jewish population in the world. I think a couple years ago that finally crossed over. I think Israel now has the largest Jewish population in the world, the United States being second. Okay, so
So there were some folks from Ethiopia
right.
that were they called Jews or were they Israelites?
Okay, many people believe that when the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon and was impressed by his wisdom, that she somehow converted to Judaism and took it back to Ethiopia with her. I made mention of this last week when I was in Israel. We went to Mount Carmel, and there is a church on top of Mount Carmel that commemorates Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And in the middle of this compound, there's this gigantic statue of Elijah. And I have a picture of that in my slides. And there's a school group. They're all sitting on the ground around the statue, hearing the biblical story of Elijah. All these students are black. They're all Ethiopians.
Mhm.
Because El Al Airlines was used for an aliyah to rescue a bunch of these Jewish people who were black, living in Ethiopia, who then immigrated to Israel. Now the problem is they've never been fully accepted. And I mentioned, you weren't here this last week, so I'll say it again. There was a major scandal still going on in Israel when I was there in 1996. And that was that there had been blood drives. And they don't have the Red Cross, they have something called Magen David, I believe it is. Anyway, a lot of the Ethiopian refugees came and they donated blood like everybody else. Well, then it came out in the news that the doctors were taking and dumping their blood down the drain because they didn't want to mix black Ethiopian blood with pure Jewish blood. And this became a huge scandal.
Well, I think
And
so.
rightly so. But anyway, no, in Israel today, you will meet blacks. But there's also a tribe in northern India that claim to be Jewish, and their name sounds very similar to Manasseh. And they were practicing Old Testament rituals. So they did a DNA study, and lo and behold, they did find a DNA link between this tribe in northern India and Israelis. And so the last I heard, they were starting to allow some immigration now from northern India back to to Israel. So again, these people may be scattered, but God knows where they're at.
Precisely.
Yeah, and
That's just a little tiny bit of evidence to prove thus.
exactly. And so, now, again, so are there remnants of the 10 northern tribes in North America today? I wouldn't doubt it a bit, because the United States has become a melting pot of so many nations. But again, I'm not saying that the British are the descendants of the 10 northern tribes. So,
That just doesn't seem to match up with the rest of history at all.
right. So when we get it further into our study now, we're gonna take a look at the division of the kingdom, and we're gonna see Rehoboam, when he takes over for his father, does not have the wisdom of his father. And again, we're gonna see the story that he has an opportunity to listen either to the wise old men or these young guys. And these young guys
See why she'd be listening to me?
better listen to him.
I'm not listening to you all.
Say, hey, you're king, do whatever you want, tax them, take control, or whatever. And socialism has never worked. And again, I don't want to get into modern day politics, but
But you
again,
can't
I'm
help yourself.
concerned about where we're headed in our own country. But anyway, Rehoboam takes control, and things do not go well, and so people willingly join up with Jeroboam. And so now you're gonna have the division of the two kingdoms. So, anyway, but getting back to Solomon, again, this is good news and bad news. And the good news we've seen, the bad news now we've seen, and that is it's possible to become corrupted. Now again, I don't believe that Solomon quote unquote lost his salvation, but I do believe he lost his blessing, his rewards. And God was merciful to him in his lifetime. Now it's interesting, David reigned for 40 years, Solomon reigned for 40 years, but Solomon was quite a bit younger than David when he died. And was this God just saying, okay, this is enough? I don't know.
I think the lesson is powerful because as we look here, we all are in varying shades of gray, and it reminds us that even though we're old and we maybe get tired and achy and think, well, our time is just about up, we have to be careful till the very end.
Right. And we had a district superintendent by the name of Kelvin Gardner from New Zealand. He was a very good man, very wise man, but he had an expression that used to drive me nuts because it scared me, and that was finishing well. He was always talking about how we all need to finish well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Solomon did not finish well. He
He did
started
not.
well, but he didn't finish well. That's a scary thought, and there's different reasons for that. We used to have a board of trustee member for Simpson from Salem, Oregon, by the name of Henry Turnage, who was
I've met the man.
he was a wonderful, godly man. And I actually was responsible for chauffeuring him around when he came to Simpson, got to know him. And he gave untold amounts of money to missions, to Simpson. To
That was the
others.
thing I remember was a great benefactor.
But during the last couple of years of his life, his family locked him in the house and wouldn't let him out. The reason was he got Alzheimer's disease.
Uh-huh.
And when he got Alzheimer's disease, it did something to his personality. And all of a sudden, he started cussing like a sailor, drunken sailor, and saying things that they had never heard him say before in his life. And if he had realized what he was saying, he would have been horrified. So this was not his fault.
Right.
This was an
a little
organic
different of not
brain
finishing well.
disease.
Yeah.
It was not a
I would say-
spiritual disease of the
I
heart.
would say he finished well because he was
Right.
finished in God's sight when
Right.
the Alzheimer's got. I'm just telling Dawn a story this morning on the way in through the fog about my mother and the things that she would say in the rest home. A godly woman who would never say those things. But
Years
when
ago,
she-
we had an elder in our church who was a engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. Very brilliant man, very serious man. Anyway, he had surgery at St. Mary's, and they put him under, and then they gave him pain medication. His family walked in and they were shocked. He was laying in his hospital bed singing old Navy songs. They had never heard this out of him in his whole life, you know? He was basically drunk. He was out of the, you know, with his pain medication.
Wow.
And when he got out of the medication, he didn't even remember doing these things, you know? So,
My
but
family.
anyway, but there's a difference, you know,
Yeah.
in that. Solomon didn't have Alzheimer's. Solomon had a heart disease.
Yeah, Solomon had
And it
Alzheimer's
wasn't
of the heart.
cholesterol. It was from his wife, so. All right, we need to get ready for our worship time.